So obviously the title is Can Business and Politics Learn to Live Each Other? Why don't politicians and business people understand each other? And what we've got is obviously 3 esteemed panellists. What I've invited them to do is just speak for around 5 minutes on that, and then we'll open it up. So we'll have a discussion about exactly that. So who'd like to go first? Joe.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
So if you want to just introduce yourself and then...
Hi, my name is Joe Zammit-Lucia. I'm one of the founders of Radix, and last year published a book on the subject, the relationship between business and politics. So can business and politics learn to love each other? Well, I guess everyone can learn to love each other, but the reality is that business and politics have, to some extent, different jobs. And my thesis is that business is becoming and needs to look at the world and its role more politically. So, and what do I mean by that? For me, politics is the process by which we decide what kind of society we want to live. It's a highly imperfect process, it's a pleasant process, but it's the process we have for deciding how we want to live and what sort of society we want to live. And business has a big impact on the kind of society that we live in, because business employs people or doesn't employ people, provides us with products and services. It has a huge impact on the kind of society. So one of the greatest myths is that somehow business is or can even be apolitical. We've lived through a period over the last 50 years where business has developed this somewhat perverse view of itself, that its only role in life is to make as much money as possible. And it was encouraged in that view by some economists, even by politicians. Tony Blair stood up and said business should focus on making money, leave the rest of social issues to others, by which he meant leave them to me. I know how to resolve it. But that's been, for the last sort of 50 years or so, it's been the dominant view of what business is about. That the role of business is to make money for its shareholders, and nothing else matters. Well, that has changed dramatically, I think, in the last 10, 15, 20 years. And the idea of maximizing shareholder value as the only purpose of business is kind of disappeared. And business now has to think about a bunch of other stakeholders, which again gets business into a political way of thinking. So one of the challenges of politics is how do you make decisions when every citizen wants something different, when everybody's pulling you in fundamentally different directions. Now, when you all believe that your purpose to satisfy only one group of people, shareholders who want to make money, then life is actually very easy. But when you start to think that when society starts to believe that business has to satisfy multiple stakeholders, each one of those stakeholders wants something different, and is pulling business in very different directions, and that requires political skills to manage. It requires being able to balance all these different forces pulling you in different directions. Which business has never really had to do, and which business schools don't teach you. They teach you how to complete spreadsheets, and they teach you how to find the right answer and how to maximize your financial returns. But business leaders of my generation were never brought up in a world where they had to be political, in the sense of having to navigate the choppy waters of different stakeholders. And that, I think, is the new skill that is required. And it's hard to develop because it's not the standard business way. Now, we're moving in that direction. Will that lead to business and politics loving each other? I'm not sure. Business and politics, politicians and governments have conflicting roles when it comes to business. They need to encourage business, obviously, because it's an important part of our economy, our life, our society. But they also have a duty to keep business in check. They have to regulate business. And if business is little business people behaved perfectly, but the reality is that we do. So politics has to balance this encouragement of business with holding business to account. And that will always be some kind of
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. So my name is Suresh Weerasinghe. I am at Aviva, the UK insurer and asset manager. But prior to joining Aviva about 5 years ago, I spent 17 years in central government as a lawyer in a variety of roles. And before I sort of make some opening remarks, I would disagree with you, Joe.
Great.
I disagree with you for two reasons. I think I do agree with you when we're talking about domestic politics and business that is domestic. I actually think some businesses have been incredibly agile where they've had to deal with international trade. Because when you're trading and you're dealing with complicated matters, and say for example rules of origin, for example, you are engaging with other governments in a way that you have to be very agile, make the kind of political trade-offs you're talking about. However, I think we have been sheltered from that a little bit in the UK because of our membership of the EU. Where basically trade policy was a matter of EU competence. That was all dealt with overseas. All you needed to deal with was the EU interface, which is basically the same as domestic politics. And therefore, I think the majority of UK companies have lost this muscle. So I do think it exists. I just think for the circumstances that the UK's found itself in, we don't have them. But I think one thing that's really interesting when you think about business and politics is actually find now that business is often trusted more than politicians. So I think you see this in some polls, and so I think there's an increasing need in political side to see themselves aligning with business, to try and align themselves with some of that trust or make up the trust deficit that they've lost. But just sort of reflecting through and on my own experience of working on both sides of the border of business and politics, I think there's sort of three things I draw out from slightly more practical or pragmatic level. First, I think there are presumptions on both sides about the level of expertise that are not necessarily true. Second, I think both sides have some quite complex processes that are not very well understood, and that really impacts agility and the ability to engage with each other. And then the third thing I say is that neither businesses nor politicians/governments are homogeneous. So there are complicated trade-offs being made, as you alluded to. So if you think about the level of expertise, and there was a really interesting comment made by Lord MacDonald after he left the post of Cabinet Secretary. And he said, why don't political parties organise themselves by subject matter interest experts? So you actually have a pool of people that could be your minister in any one topic. And therefore, if you want to fire someone, you want to do a reshuffle, you actually have people steeped in the subject matter. Because one of the big myths about politics is that ministers do not know what they're not often. It's very rare to see someone like George Freeman who's dedicated his life to a particular area. But the second secret is civil servants often don't know what they're talking about. And both bodies are loath tables. So business needs to learn to talk to politicians and to policymakers in a way that often takes some quite technical subject matters. I mean, you think about insurance, you think about, I think we mentioned a few times, Solvency II. Well, how Solvency II captured the political imagination for 3 or 4 months is beyond me. Solvency II is, I think, the only bit of legislation that was so complicated to explain that it's actually been a diagram, a calculation. But it became like that. So we need to be able to break those ideas down, have a conversation in a way that politicians understand. I think equally, politicians assume that business leaders are expert in matters of policy and that they're able to make it kind of trade-offs to see. I don't think they are. I think the real truth is what business is after is just policy certainty and stability. We're not really after constant change to constantly tweak the regulatory agenda and dive in between the gaps and arbitrage the margins or as it's often portrayed, particularly in the financial services world. I think you see this a little bit with sort of hedge funds, certain types of private equity, but that's a really small piece. Ultimately, you just have the stability and certainty. Just in terms of the process, I think there is a presumption that ministers can do what they want, government politicians can do what they want, which is just not true. We have cabinet collective responsibility at the Whitehall level. There is a constant internal negotiation going on within government. So this idea that you can go to a minister and get a change made is just a fallacy. And there are countless times I sit around a room and people say, "Oh, I know so and so, and I know the minister will go and see them." Actually, working from the ground up, getting the civil servants understanding policy trade-offs that business wants them to make, and then work it up so it's a fully formed plan. Everyone thinks that you have a conversation at the top is going to filter down. But equally, I don't think business is quite as agile and nimble as politicians seem to think. And businesses, particularly as you mentioned, in terms of heavily regulated sectors, we have to move out often in many ways quite slowly. Like we have investment committees, we have boards, we have multiple layers of checks and balances so that we are held to account. And yet, you see this in the moment, you're all aware, I'm sure, of the debate going on in the paper about can we move pension funds into financing everything in the UK. But, we cannot move that money quickly. That money is actually invested already, by the way. It's not sitting there and pulls it. We're not like Donald Duck. We don't go for a swim in this money every morning. And so it takes time. And so you have to understand and appreciate that. And I think that comes back to this long-term policy signalling. If government gives you stability and certainty, then you can actually support policy outcomes. And I think there's a big question mark here. Maybe some people in the room will have a view on this. Should we have an industrial strategy? Because if you have an industrial strategy, you start having a baseline that actually business will work from. And then the final thing is just coming back to sort of the trade-offs. I think policy isn't made in a vacuum. We don't sit in these policy silos. As I mentioned before, there's this constant internal negotiation going on inside government, and therefore I often see people pitch up, often my colleagues inside parts of the business, and they say, "Oh, we found this rule in the government accounting system. We found this rule somewhere. Now, if they just turn that off, we could do X, Y, and Z." They don't actually ask, why does that rule exist? What is the policy rationale behind that? And therefore, it's not really that easy for government to put a red line through something. Then I think on the flip side, from a business perspective, I think, Joe, I agree with you. Increasingly, and particularly for a business like Aviva, there are a number of competing interests. It's not about the bottom line. So we've got shareholders, we've got customers who now have access to Twitter and all sorts of social media where they can ruin you overnight. You've got net zero climate commitments, and then you've got things like social impact and how do we play out in the community. There's a lot. Where do you get to? I think it's really interesting of you saying businesses have to become more politically savvy. In the FT recently, I read an article which said, should businesses have a chief political officer?
Saw it, yes.
That sounds like a good job for me, actually. Give me a good pay rise if I put a chief in front of my name, wouldn't it? But I think there's an interesting point just in the context of York, and interesting having colleagues here from the York environment involved in the devolution deal, because actually, when you get into that devolution space, when you get more policy responsibility, when you're going to have to deal with the likes of us for investment, actually local government, combined authorities and business are going to have to learn to love each other more. They're going to have to learn to understand each other more. And that is probably, I think, a bigger challenge than better re-engagement at the Whitehall.
Thank you. Paula.
I'm going to be much shorter.
Sorry.
Okay. So my background is that I've worked in industry for 25 years, for Exxon, for Northern Foods, for Bass, and for Mars. So I've got working inside an institute, working inside a big FTSE businesses.
Right.
It is. Then I've got my own system. The the last role that I had in industry was Director of Sustainability for Northern Foods, which supplied all the food for all major supermarkets that you would microwave or put in the oven. I then set my own sustainability business up, and then 5 years ago got involved in local politics because of Brexit. So that's my background in a nutshell. So from where I'm sat, I think there's a couple of things going on. The big reason that politics and business don't really trust each other and don't want to have conversation is timescales. So if there was a certainty going forwards for the next 10, 5, more than 5, 10, 15, 20 years, if you had a time scale for business to make sure that they knew what was going on and get proper engagement. Instead, what we have is we've got a 5-year national electoral cycle, 4-year local electoral cycle, and within that cycle, the first year very little happens because everybody's deciding that everything everybody else does was not quite what they wish to do. Then you get 2 or 3 years of where they get what they wish to do to happen politically, and then you get the final year where they don't want to make any errors, which is where we're currently at in our general election cycle, so that they don't screw up the next election. So you have 3 years where people see things like that. Businesses, yes, they report every 12, 16 weeks, whatever their reporting cycle is, but actually they're planning for the next 20 years. If they are Cllr, if they are Aviva, if they are Nestle, they are not going to build and invest if they don't know what the next policies are for the next 10, 15 years. They need certainty to put their investment in to make sure that the shareholder gets the return. They also need certainty to make sure they put the investment in correct so they can recruit. So I think businesses are quite political, because if they don't do the political correctness of making sure that you've got the environment, you're looking after your people, you're looking after your consumers, you're not going to recruit, you're not going to get the right people, you're not going to sell the right product to make the profits. And in order to do that, they need an environment that they are securing, not political system that we've currently got, which goes from red to blue, from blue to red, and nothing in between. We need it more stable. And that's what I would argue. I think both sides of that area, whether you're in business or whether you're in politics, really want to make it work for residents, for businesses, for the country, for our children, for our older people. But we need some stability rather than the yo-yoing that we get.
Thank you. So, there we go. Right, so have we got any questions from the floor? Please.
My initial question, following up on that, is there any evidence that countries in PR have more stable environments by businesses?
Just outside of Germany.
Yeah.
Germany.
And
And it's much more stable. At the moment, it's going through a small recession, but it's not normally.
so that would be another argument for PR.
Yeah. So,
Certainly.
I'm a big fan of PR, and I worked in
That's proportional representation.
yes.
yeah.
But having worked actually in proportional representation governments in New Zealand, I'm not sure that they necessarily deliver more stability. But what I'm not sure I agree with is that actually we do have this yo-yoing. Okay, if you look back over the last 3 major political chunks of time, we had Labour, which was in for like 13 years, the Tories were in for what, 13 years before that. But this current government has been in for 13 years. But actually, within the course of this one government, we have had lots of weird things happen. Now, you've got a government that came in with the Lib Dem coalition, which probably wasn't really expected. So you didn't get that certainty from the outset. Then you had Brexit,
Yes.
which was probably a choice that David Cameron made that threw all his political stability into question. And then we've had a series of governments and prime ministers that have come in without any signalling of what's going on before them. So, you have Boris and he won his majority, but then you had Liz Truss, you've now got Sunak who's come into power to clean up one mess. But actually, the only thing we ever knew about him was an agenda that he campaigned on in an internal party perspective that he was never able to deliver as Prime Minister because he was brought in as a technocrat to sort out the mess that had been created. So I'm not necessarily sure it is our political or electoral cycle that's given us this turbulence. I think we've had turbulence over 30 years because, well, there's a number of ways of putting it, but none of which are particularly good to say. But I think actually we have seen stability over the previous cycles.
Joe.
But also, wouldn't we all like stability and certainty in our lives? That's not the real world. The real world is unpredictable and uncertain, and the future is always uncertain. And it's not just political issues. Politicians did cause the financial crash. Business. Who would have predicted COVID?
And so the kind of issues that we've been working on is that it's actually
Nobody could have prevented that. Well, maybe they could, but they didn't. Russia invaded Ukraine. These are all events that happen. And this idea of business, I want stability and I want continuity and I want and I want certainty. This is just fantasy.
I'm not taking it to that point. What I'm saying is the policies inside a country. You can't predict the rain. You can't predict that climate change will do in the next few years. You can't predict a number of different things. What you can do is look at where you've got and where you're going into the future and say, actually, this is the rules that we want this country to run by.
But that changes.
But what I'm saying is, during a political cycle, what it goes from is, do you want to high taxes over here and look after these people over there, or low taxes over here and make sure that everything's back to the shareholder? And what you're looking for is, can we have stability in what policies of the country are? Not stabilities in what world events are. Nobody can predict
No,
that.
but those policies
That's
flow
very
from
different.
that.
I don't know.
What you do about tax changes once you have a financial crash.
But if you know the underlying policy basis that a country is going to move forward on, the dialogue between business and government can be very positive.
Yes.
In times of stress or external buffeting like Ukraine, you can get business and politics talking together saying, we're going in that direction, this external event's knocked us sideways, but we know that that's the conversation about how do we as a country manoeuvre to go towards the direction we want. So it's absolutely right, the world is inherently uncertain. If you create a policy stability, then at least you know the basis on which you're both trying to work together. And this is not policy stability purely in the interest of business. So we saw, I think, was it yesterday or the day before, about 100 or so big developers in the UK wrote to government and said, look, can you reform the planning rules and put what you want from us for climate and sustainability in? Now you might say, actually, that's not really in business interest. But what we've got to the conclusion of is actually, we're going to have to do this stuff, having our own rules, and maybe get accused of brainwashing and then not quite knowing how to do it. Just set standards and let's get on with it.
Yeah, to that point, so my name's Mark Robinson, I chair of Government High Street Task Force. I'm a chair of government body. I also run an investment business. I'm sort of often in meetings feeling very confused about which side of the table I'm on. Often on the government side, and I've got my colleagues from the private sector coming in to talk to the government about stuff. And it occurs to me, the private sector often talks to government when they've got a problem that the government wants to fix. And that's their agenda. Government talks to the private sector when they want them to do something they can't afford to do. And it could very nearly be aligned, but it very rarely is, because there's this lack of shared language. Because again, it's very reactive and very short-termism. Whereas actually, if we sat down and decided, again, it's back to this long-term issue that too. So these are the long-term challenges. These are our aspirations. This is our common endeavour. How do we come together? That would be a different conversation. But that's not how it happens. It's reaction against things. To Joe's point, it's a reaction to we've got a crisis. How do we solve this? Not here's the challenge, here's the opportunity, how do you long term work together? So there needs to be a change of tone in the debate, and this alignment of interest and this common endeavour.
But I also just think the other thing is the conduit. So I think the way business, the conduit of the discussion, right? So basically, because we've had so many opinions, we've had so many ministers, and we've had so many people, there is this army of experts who may or may not have any level of competence that populate a whole host of consultancies that every business uses. Now, this used to work because actually you didn't have that many ministers, you didn't have that many spares, so actually the people that would come in were actually quite good. But you've now got a bunch of people of dubious expertise on either side, filtering the conversation between business and government, and it just makes the conversation really, really difficult. And, you know, I think there is a real issue there about government cutting through that, about business cutting through that. And the dialogue being, as you say, much more constant and not solely about issues, and actually the dialogue being direct, not mediated by sort of classy interactions, basically.
Are you saying that there's limited interaction in it?
No, there is interaction, but it does this as
Yeah.
opposed to this. Yeah.
What I would really pick up on was the word you used about language.
Yeah.
So coming from business into local government, I had to learn an entire new lexicon.
Right.
So the way that it's discussed, so you've got just the way that it's discussed and the way that even the finances are presented are utterly different to the way that you've worked in your business. It's utterly different. And that took a long time to be confident, you know, that I was now talking effectively French rather than English in the conversations that you're having with people.
No, I agree that language is different. That's part of it. It's a bit of a term.
It's almost like knowledge is power. I'm going to use this language to global this.
It's also because you're looking at the world at different lenses. So, you know, the job being done is different.
Did you find that it was artificial? Did you
Yes.
find a lot very different to the real world in
No, it's, all worlds are real.
Yeah.
Right, so I understand why you
Yeah.
put the
Yeah.
exclamation mark. So all worlds are real, and it is a different lens that you're looking through. But the language that is currently being used, from my experience in local government, is not as clear, as objective as the language that I experience in business. So there was a lot of times where I was doing a translation, and it was interesting that it was clothed in that manner.
Pete,
So speak about actually with the council, I fully agree with that, Paula. And actually the accounting is totally different to the way that you do
It's the wrong way around.
systems.
It's literally the wrong way around. So if you understand accounting in business,
Yeah, but I think to be fair to the government's accountants, they do it in that way because that's the way they've been asked to present information over the years for political reasons, probably as much as for the decision-making reasons. I think just to get it back to high-level principles, if you like, fundamentally, we politicians represent the people who vote. You know, we tend to represent the people who vote, not the people who don't bother voting, but we tend to represent the people who vote. And of course, businesses represent their owners, whether they're shareholders or individual business owners. And in that sort of Venn diagram, there is a big crossover in the middle. And I think the job of far-sighted politicians and business owners is to grow that overlap. Well, that sounds easy, but it's not necessarily, because we have competing demands and competing hopes and desires and interests, and how do we grow that together? Because if we don't, then the future's not so great.
So absolutely.
Come back to this language point, because I think there's actually something interesting under the surface there. So in government, you operate in a very hierarchical fashion because that's the way it operates, right? The politicians are elected, the power flows down, you have his departments, so you get given your task to deliver that policy or to do X or Y or Z. In the private sector, and this was my big learning when I went to Aviva, you basically get given your budget and you're told to come back with a result at the end of the year. So the way that the business actually has to communicate is that you have the chief executive has to set the strategy. It has to communicate it in a way that those of us that are going out and delivering that strategy understand and all get rowing in the same direction. Now, I've been in Aviva 5 years, and it's only in the last 2 years that we had a CEO that's managed to communicate through the business in a way that we all get it. So I think sometimes, so whether you agree with me, I think sometimes externally it looks like business are being a lot clearer when actually they're not. And internally, the business itself isn't understanding what its own strategy is meant to be doing, and therefore you've just got all these different people running out, legitimately thinking they're doing the right thing, but they're running in lots of different directions and just causing havoc.
And just out of interest, we're talking about big business here. 99% of businesses in the UK are small.
Yeah.
Right.
Interaction with them, how does that work? How do they get a voice?
More difficult.
Much more difficult, and that is usually on the local level through the Chamber of Commerce. Also, yeah, talk to your MPs, talk to your local council, but actually through the Chamber of Commerce as well, because the Chamber of Commerce will have different groups, which depending which type of business they are, whether they're lawyers, whether they're food manufacturers, whatever it is that they are, and they can represent them on the local level and then on the national level. So that's how you do it, because small businesses, and most of the businesses are less than 5 people, so small businesses and people who are either in government or who are in, central government would not have the time to talk to everybody in that way. So that's where you want to make sure that the conversation is concentrated and directed in a mechanism that can deliver results, rather than lots of little conversations that don't go anywhere.
Also, from a policy point of view, it's kind of different to a big business, small business. Although you're right, small and medium-sized businesses constitute the bulk of business activity. Each individual business doesn't.
Yeah.
So, if the corner shop goes out of business, that's bad for the corner shop and the family that runs it, but nobody really notices. Whereas if Barclays goes bankrupt, that's a thing.
Focus is fun, but we better now.
You're right. So I think there's a difference between when we talk about business, big business, small business, and individual businesses. The lens is something different.
Sharon,
The aspect of a sector that sometimes gets lost in the US between business and business wants and steering on content graduates before transparency. And even in public trust design is really what is actually software design. There's been sections of business and government design are actually innovation, learning by experiment, WhatsApp groups, and all the rest of the vaccine. That's the message you're announcing, even this and the other people. I think also not everything developed itself by the age of 6 months that think about business. In their relationship with it, in a way that actually. So you've got to understand and accommodate people that so segmentation is, and they have opportunities in their lives. So we need to wait for accepting of the right world, but also that's the answer that the friendship of them what we can gain out of it. And so that has and that's the usage to realise good design and marvelous.
Yeah, so I agree, and I think one thing that's got lost a little bit in the UK is
sorry about that. Go on, Graham. Sorry,
I think one of the things that's been lost in the UK is more structured and formal ways of business and government talking at the civil service level. Because if you have that, it is generally well documented, it is logged, and actually you can then have steady, in terms of your points of having the dialogues, you can then have steady policy discussions at a technical level. I think nowadays we tend to talk generally at CEO to politician level, and that's when I think it gets murky generally because both sides are just too busy. For the young, John knows this, but for us to brief a CEO is a real pain in the ass. It's making time So you have to sort of try and think of every possibility and come up with a line for everything.
It's a big dark.
So everything's a soundbite. Equally on the other side, some poor civil servants that are briefing for a minister probably has never turned his mind to meeting with the Aviva CEO. So I think we need to have I think we need more, but better structured and I agree, more transparent, more accountable.
Can I just ask a question on reverse? Oh God. So I'm intrigued that the university thinks it's between the two. When the university is a huge business, you've got 28,000 students paying 25 million between 9 and 20 something thousand pounds a year to your business. So you are a major business in employing 3,000 people within a city. You employ 1,900.
Also lobbying for self-interest.
So actually, you are a big business. We absolutely are, although academics, we are we're a big business. We're across the restaurant. Every hospital, I don't want to show us the fact that we're all apparently right to 18-year-olds, but I'm quite honest. The funding model for UK higher education is currently locked up significantly by the international student fees, and the government who are fees and aid of no one knows what to do about this. But we're still expected to come to the party on being science and change. The free riders in all of this, quite frankly, are employers, because they're not really running squat the funding model. In all the debtors and students, we are now teaching UK students actually support the boss and the government. Every time we open their mouth about anything to do with immigration, the one controllable cohorts that they can take a pop at are the international students who are coming in here, who have for years been popping up research in terms of cross subsidy and are now literally cross subsidising UK students. That's why I feel we're actually interested. I get it. And that is a basic fact.
Just to speak with Suresh's point, the other problem with getting CEOs to go into any room is ego. They're not very good at admitting to failings and mistakes, and quite often if you are opposite government, you want to be able to honestly reflect on something that's not going well. I've been in meetings on the other side of the government side of the fence, where CEOs of major companies, multi-billion companies, have sat there. They've got a 20-minute window maybe at most, or probably more like 5-minute chance on a panel to say something, and they spend 4 minutes saying what a brilliant business they've got. And then they sort of, oh, by the way, business rates are rich, and then the ministers and the civil servants walk away from that thinking, it's mostly pretty good out there. There's no problems in the real estate industry. Whereas I just go, what a wasted opportunity. So I'm sure the Aviva CEO is a perfectly wonderful and pragmatic person. He'd be very honest about problems within the
You okay?
I wanted to ask, the public utilities that are privatised, so the water company, which clearly has gone horribly wrong, just in your opinion, what about the way that it was done made it go so badly wrong? How should it have been done to make it go well? What would you do now to try and fix it?
This is the water company.
Water company, because it's totally for profit and everything like that. Well, I don't know, I've got my own opinions, but I'm just interested to know.
I've only been in politics for 4 or 5 years. Margaret Thatcher sold off everything so that we could have whatever boom was then created. We didn't follow the Norwegian model where they ended up with oil and water, making sure that they got a sovereign wealth fund that actually subsidises and supports the entirety of their country. Southern Ireland are now doing exactly the same. They've created a sovereign wealth fund. I disagreed. At the time, I think I was 17, 18, when all the privatisation stuff started to happen. I disagreed with it at the time. I don't know how you wrote that down.
So what is this sovereign wealth fund?
The sovereign wealth fund for Norway is that they did it all from the gas and oil that they discovered. So what they did, instead of giving tax breaks, instead of supporting what was required inside of their country at the time, they used a little bit of it to do that, but they actually invested it. They now have over, I think, if my numbers are right, and you seem to know much more about it than me, is they've got over, I think it's 60 billion turning over every year, and the profits from that sovereign wealth fund actually support a a living wage for everybody in the country. It supports education, it does the transport, it does the health. And that's where, instead of giving the tax breaks that we did with the oil and gas from the North Sea, they invested it. So different models at different times. We are where we are now.
We do have, so I think that there's obviously a policy and political question whether you want to reprivatise certain assets. And I think a lot of the discussion that we've heard today and yesterday in a lot of these tents around things that belong to the community. I think there's some valid questions there about privatised and whether we want to if we are really going to manage the community. I think there's a question between ownership and how you run it, and I think there is definitely a role for private sector in helping run and develop things. It doesn't mean they need to own the asset and own the right to it. Oil's a really good example of how they're horribly wrong. But I do think actually, whilst it's well, it's not necessarily amusing because it takes up a lot of my time, but this debate about the pension money is probably why we don't in this country have a work fund, because actually that system was operating in that way. Now, it wasn't going into public services, but it was actually going into UK businesses, which then supports the idea that you let business do more. It's kind of an odd thing, because it's some really interesting social policy decisions around what kind of pension schemes that we want to have going forward, following, really, I suppose it all kicked off with the Maxwell thing. Now, actually, what we've ended up doing, and it's quite interesting, we didn't hear a lot of this, well, I didn't hear a lot of it in the sessions I was at, but what it's done is moved the risk to the individual. Once you move the risk to the individual, the financial regulator is going to come along rightly and just say, hang on a minute, you've got to be very careful how you deal with that person's money because it's their retirement savings. That combined with some weird regulatory decisions or pensions also meant that we lost some of this impact. So the thing that I think was missing a little bit from the discussions over the last few days, I think there's a really big question in this country about where should risk lie. Have we ended up leaving the most vulnerable in society bearing the heaviest levels of risk? And actually some of the businesses and some of the more broad shoulders parts of society need to bear more risk in order to deliver some of these outcomes. And business needs to step into that space, I think.
So one of the good things that's happened with pensions, or what you said for the pension things, is one of the Lib Dem councillors, Cllr Bassett, has sat on the North Yorkshire and York for all the councils. What he's managed to achieve, and given he was one Lib Dem and there was one Labour and the rest of them were Conservatives on the board, he managed to achieve over 18 months was to get them to move some of their funding, instead of where it was being funded, into sustainable areas. And he got over £200 million moved so that actually it was doing more social good. The reason they agreed to it was not only was it doing more social good, it was actually giving a better return. So they're the types of conversations that pension funds and big investors can have with businesses to say, not only is it doing the right thing, it's going to make you more moves. This is the next business model that should all be polishing.
Can I respond to the water question? Let's remember that in the late 70s, this country was not in the best place. We were in a mess. We just had been bailed out by the MMF. We had the winter of discontent. This country was a mess. So let's not romanticize. Privatization was fashionable at that time. There was the ideological view that the public sector owning all these businesses was not working. We may agree with that or disagree with it, and that privatization was the way forward. And that was fashion. And in fact, it spread, continued to many other countries. Now, we're now 40 years later. Okay, so that's quite a while. Sovereign wealth funds. Look at the countries that have established good and successful and large sovereign wealth funds. They're countries that are not like the UK. They're countries that had a huge amount of oil wealth relative to the size of their population. And therefore the amount of public services they can rectify. Qatar, Emirates, Norway, we're not like those countries. You know, we're not like those countries. The amount of sort of oil wealth that we had relative to the population and the amount of expenditure therefore that we had to put on public services, the equation is very different. Now, we maybe could have done better, maybe we could have established some kind of wealth fund, but I don't think that the dynamics are the same that we could have done in Norway or the UAE or Qatar. The dynamics are quite different.
Ireland is starting this. Let's see if they get it going in a
just
significant way.
And they've adopted a different one. And they're a smaller country too. You know, that with size comes complexity. So I think, you know, now 40 years later, we're dissatisfied with what the water companies are doing. Which, okay, it's reasonable to be dissatisfied. What we do about it is not very clear to me, and I doubt it's very clear to anybody. You know, these things can't be resolved like that. There's no doubt that the water and much other infrastructure in this country needs a huge amount of investment because a lot of it is Victorian, a lot of it is out of date. You know, we had infrastructure in this country well before most other European countries because we were first in the Industrial Revolution. So everything is breaking down. So there's a need for a huge amount of investment. Where's that going to come from? Is it all going to be taxpayers' money? Is it all going to be private money? And if it's going to be private money, who's going to get the profits? You know, it's these are not easy things to resolve.
I think it's also the result of such a long period of underinvestment, which is why you have a huge problem now. So I was thinking in terms of how should it be differently in a way so that the infrastructure had kept pace, so you're not stuck in this position however many years later, where there is, and you say, where's the money in the company? I quite agree with you. But how should it have been done differently so we didn't arrive at where we are now?
Unfortunately, we are where we are.
Yes.
One of the conversations that
Could be learned
one of the
from
conversations your council has been having with Yorkshire Water is that 2 hours every day of the year, sewage is disposed into our rivers. And the amount of money that Yorkshire Water have invested in York over the last 4 years while I've been involved with it is less than the amount of money that Yorkshire Water invested in making sure that York would have clean drinking. And I found that really important task of having conversations with them. We are back to what we've said, we are where we are. We cannot erase the last 40 years. Aren't we all great? Hindsight's fantastic.
Yes.
We would all do it differently. We can all see where the errors are. Whereas when we try and plot forward, you can't plot for the Ukrainian war. You can't plot for the pandemic. You can't plot for your child being bloody 5'11" in your book defence action. You know, all this type of stuff. So we are where we are, but what we've got to try and do is work out for the next 5-10 years how we make that work. And for York, and I know that the Labour guys will see it through because I've had conversations with the two ladies who are now in charge of that portfolio, is how we incentivise or complain in a very constructive way to get Yorkshire Water to do the right thing for York, the right thing for the 210,000 residents, the right thing for the 10 million visitors, and the right thing for the biodiversity down rivers. And we are now having sensible conversations with them rather than them doing that and shouting.
Yeah, I think that's definitely.
So that's a good place to finish. Our time is up. Thank you for attending. Really appreciate it. Good session.
I just want to add the bar is